My name is Emma Carter, and I'm 32 years old. The whisper came just as the wedding music began. My father leaned toward me, keeping the smile on his face so none of the guests would notice, and said quietly enough that only I could hear him, "Don't ruin your sister's wedding." Then he straightened his tie, patted my shoulder like he'd just said something kind, and walked away to greet another guest. I stood there holding my champagne glass, wondering how someone could turn 6 words into something that weighed more than an entire lifetime. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that. It was just the first time he said, in a room full of people who would soon discover how wrong he'd been. At that moment, I had no idea that less than an hour later, a federal judge would stop the reception in front of nearly 300 guests because he recognized me before anyone else did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My family had always treated me like the mistake that somehow never corrected itself. My younger sister, Olivia, was the golden child. She was beautiful, outgoing, and seemed to glide through life collecting praise without ever asking for it. My parents adored introducing her to strangers. "This is our daughter, Olivia. She just finished law school." Every sentence about her sounded like a trophy being placed on a shelf. When it came to me, introductions were much shorter. "This is Emma." Nothing more. No mention of my work. No mention of my accomplishments. No mention of the years I'd spent building a career that most people couldn't even imagine. It wasn't because they didn't know. It was because they preferred pretending none of it existed. Whenever relatives asked what I did for a living, my father usually answered before I could. "She works for the government." Then he'd immediately change the subject. People assumed I had some boring office job. I never corrected them. Explaining myself had stopped feeling worthwhile years ago. Some truths lose their value when nobody wants to hear them. 3 weeks before Olivia's wedding, my mother called. She didn't ask how I was. She never did. "The rehearsal dinner is Friday," she said. "I know. Wear something simple." I usually do. "And please." She paused. "Don't make this about yourself." I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. "Mom," I said carefully, "it's a wedding." I planned on sitting quietly, eating cake, and going home. "You have a way of attracting attention." "No," I answered softly. "I have a way of existing." She ignored that. Olivia deserves one perfect day. The call ended a few minutes later, leaving me staring at my phone in silence. It amazed me how someone could accuse another person of creating drama while manufacturing it themselves. The truth was almost disappointing in its simplicity. I loved my sister. We weren't especially close anymore, but I genuinely wanted her to be happy. I wasn't jealous. I wasn't angry. I wasn't secretly hoping something would go wrong. I simply wanted to celebrate her marriage and disappear before anyone noticed me. That had become my specialty, disappearing. The wedding took place at an old estate just outside Boston. Everything looked like something out of a magazine. White roses lined the stone walkway. Crystal chandeliers hung inside the ballroom. A string quartet played softly while waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with champagne. It was elegant without feeling excessive. Exactly the kind of wedding my parents had always dreamed of giving Olivia. I arrived 15 minutes early wearing a navy blue dress I'd owned for almost 4 years. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive, nothing that might accidentally attract attention. Apparently, even my wardrobe had learned to apologize for taking up space. My mother spotted me almost immediately. She hugged me without warmth and adjusted the collar of my dress. "Good," she said. "You look appropriate." Appropriate. That was probably the nicest compliment she'd given me in years. My father joined us a moment later. He looked me over from head to toe. "Thanks for not making this difficult." I blinked. I literally just walked through the door. He smiled. "I know." Then he wandered off to greet another guest before I could respond. I watched him disappear into the crowd and reminded myself that today wasn't about me. It was Olivia's day. I could survive a few awkward comments. I'd survived much worse. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Olivia looked happier than I'd ever seen her. For nearly 30 minutes, none of the old family tension mattered. She laughed. She cried. She kissed her new husband while everyone applauded. I found myself smiling. Not because everything was perfect, but because for a little while everyone had forgotten to treat me like a problem. After the ceremony, guests moved into the reception hall. Round tables filled the room beneath enormous glass chandeliers. A jazz trio replaced the string quartet. Servers carried plates with practiced precision. Everywhere I looked, people were laughing, relaxed, comfortable. My family, however, seemed strangely tense. My father checked the entrance every few minutes. My mother kept whispering with Olivia's new father-in-law. They looked nervous. Not excited. Nervous. I assumed it was because an important guest hadn't arrived yet. About 20 minutes later, quiet conversations around the ballroom suddenly began to fade. Heads turned toward the entrance. Several attorneys I recognized from television stood up almost immediately. Then I saw why. A tall man with silver hair walked through the doors wearing a perfect, tailored dark suit instead of judicial robes. Even without an introduction, his presence changed the room. People instinctively stepped aside. Conversations stopped. Respect has a strange kind of gravity. Someone beside me whispered, "That's Judge Nathaniel Brooks from the federal court." The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. I looked down at my wine glass, hoping nobody would notice the sudden change in my expression. Unfortunately, someone already had. The reception hall buzzed with the comfortable noise of celebration, but something about the atmosphere had shifted the moment. Judge Nathaniel Brooks walked through the doors. People who had been laughing a second earlier suddenly stood a little straighter. Conversations changed from casual gossip to polite introductions. Even the wedding planner hurried across the room to greet him personally. My father almost jogged toward the judge with a smile so wide it looked rehearsed. "Your Honor, what an incredible honor. Thank you for coming." Judge Brooks shook his hand politely, but his attention drifted past him for the briefest moment. Toward me. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Still, my stomach tightened. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe he was simply looking around the room. I picked up a glass of sparkling water and moved toward the quieter side of the ballroom, hoping to disappear before anyone expected conversation. That had always been my safest strategy. Across the room, Olivia was greeting relatives with effortless warmth. She looked beautiful, genuinely happy, and for a moment, I forgot every awkward conversation that had happened before the ceremony. She deserved this day. I wasn't about to become the reason people remembered anything else. "Emma." I turned to see Olivia walking toward me. "I'm so glad you came." She hugged me without hesitation. "You've been hiding all evening." I smiled. "I'm giving you the spotlight. That's kind of the point." She laughed. "You've always hated crowds." "Not crowds," I corrected. "Just unnecessary attention." Before she could answer, my mother appeared beside us as if she'd been monitoring the conversation from across the room. "The photographer needs family pictures." She looked directly at me. "And Emma, try not to wander off." I wasn't planning to. For some reason, she didn't look convinced. The family gathered beneath an enormous floral arch while the photographer arranged everyone into neat rows. My parents insisted Olivia and her husband stand in the center. They stood proudly beside them. I naturally stepped toward the end of the line. It wasn't intentional anymore. After years of family photographs, everyone simply knew where I belonged. "Perfect," the photographer said. Everyone smiled. Just as he lifted the camera, another voice interrupted. "One moment." Every head turned. Judge Brooks had crossed half the ballroom and was now standing only a few feet away. "I'm terribly sorry," he said politely. "I don't mean to interrupt." The photographer lowered his camera. "No problem, Your Honor." The judge's eyes settled on me again. Not on Olivia. Not on my parents. On me. There was no confusion in his expression. Only careful concentration. It felt as though he was searching through years of memories, trying to place a face he knew he had seen before. My father stepped forward quickly. Judge Brooks, this is my family. The judge nodded without looking away from me. I suspected as much. A strange silence settled over the group. My mother forced a nervous laugh. My older daughter, Emma. The judge repeated my first name quietly. Emma. He tilted his head slightly. We've met before. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. My parents exchanged confused glances. I felt every eye in the room move toward me. I searched my memory. Federal judges weren't exactly people you forgot meeting. I'm sorry, Your Honor, I said honestly. I don't believe we've been introduced. A faint smile appeared on his face. No, we weren't introduced. His answer only deepened the mystery. He folded his hands in front of him. You were wearing a different uniform. For a second, my heartbeat stopped. Only 3 people outside my former agency knew about that assignment. Judge Brooks wasn't supposed to be one of them. I kept my expression calm, but inside, questions crashed into each other. How could he possibly know? More importantly, what was he about to say in front of nearly 300 wedding guests? For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound in the ballroom was the soft clink of silverware and the distant music from the string quartet that had continued playing, unaware that nearly every guest had stopped paying attention. Judge Brooks took another step toward me. His expression wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was the expression of someone who had finally solved a puzzle that had been bothering him for years. You probably don't remember me, he said. We only met for a few minutes. I searched his face again. I'm sorry, I don't. He nodded as if he'd expected that answer. It was 6 years ago. The number alone made my heart race. 6 years! A lifetime ago. Before I'd changed careers. Before I'd learned that some chapters of life were better left closed. You testified during a sealed federal hearing, he continued quietly. Not as a defendant. Not as a witness to a crime. You testified because your analysis prevented an innocent man from spending the rest of his life in prison. The room fell completely silent. My father's confident smile disappeared. My mother looked at me as though she were seeing a stranger. I lowered my eyes for a moment. That case? I'd promised myself I would never talk about it again. Not because I regretted it, because the people involved had already lost enough. Judge Brooks looked toward the guests before speaking again. I've presided over thousands of cases during my career. He paused. I remember very few people. His eyes returned to mine. But I remember professionals who refuse to compromise the truth, even when powerful people pressure them to do otherwise. A murmur spread through the ballroom. Guests began whispering to one another. Someone asked, "What does she do?" Someone else answered, "I thought her father said she was just a government employee." Judge Brooks smiled slightly. That's technically true. He turned toward my parents. What he didn't mention is that your daughter led one of the most respected forensic intelligence teams working alongside multiple federal agencies. My mother's face lost every trace of color. My father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Olivia stared at me in disbelief.
You
never told me. I gave her a sad smile. You never asked. She looked down at the floor. The words weren't meant to hurt her. They simply happened to be true. Judge Brooks continued. The evidence Ms. Carter uncovered exposed fabricated reports, corrupt investigators, and millions of dollars in financial fraud. Several attorneys sitting near the front exchanged surprised glances. One of them whispered my name as if he had suddenly remembered reading it somewhere. Years ago. I recommended her for the director's medal, Judge Brooks said. She declined the public ceremony. That caught everyone's attention. Even I laughed softly. It wasn't my case alone, I said. There were dozens of people who deserved that recognition. The judge nodded with obvious respect. And that's exactly why I remember you. He looked around the ballroom. Humility is becoming a rare quality. Across the room, I noticed my father gripping the back of a chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. For years, he'd introduced me with 4 dismissive words. She works for the government. Now those same words sounded painfully incomplete. A guest approached him with a confused expression. Richard, why didn't you ever mention any of this? My father forced a weak laugh. It just never came up. The guest frowned. Your daughter helped expose federal corruption. He shook his head. I'd be telling everyone. For the first time in my life, I watched my father struggle to answer a simple question. Judge Brooks wasn't finished. He looked back at me. Ms. Carter. His voice softened. I've wanted to thank you properly for years. He extended his hand. The justice those families received began with your courage. I shook his hand. Not because everyone was watching, but because, after all these years, someone remembered the work, not the title. Not the recognition, but the purpose behind it. As the applause slowly began to spread through the ballroom, I noticed my mother standing completely still. She wasn't looking at Judge Brooks anymore. She was looking at me, and for the first time, she looked like she realized she had spent years judging a daughter she had never truly known. The applause faded slowly, not because Judge Brooks had asked for it, because people simply didn't know what to say next. The ballroom that had been filled with effortless conversation only minutes earlier now felt strangely quiet. Guests who had barely noticed me all evening suddenly looked at me with curiosity instead of indifference. Judge Brooks gave my hand one final shake. It was good to see you again, Ms. Carter. The honor is mine, Your Honor. He smiled. No, the honor belongs to people who choose integrity when nobody is watching. With that, he returned to his table. The reception gradually came back to life, but it wasn't the same. Conversations had changed. People weren't talking about the flowers or the food anymore. They were talking about the woman everyone thought they already knew. A few minutes later, Olivia found me standing alone on the terrace overlooking the ocean. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stood beside me without saying a word. I owe you an apology, she finally whispered. I looked at her. For what? For never asking who you really were. I smiled sadly. You were building your own life. I don't blame you. She shook her head. No, I accepted the version of you that everyone else handed me. That wasn't fair. For the first time in years, there were no expectations between us. Just two sisters having an honest conversation. I've always admired you, she admitted. I just didn't know how much there was to admire. I laughed softly. You don't need to admire me. I'd settle for having my sister back. Without another word, she hugged me. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment. It was quiet, real. The kind of hug that repairs something neither person realized had been broken for years. As we walked back inside, my father was waiting near the ballroom entrance. He looked older somehow. The confidence he'd worn all evening had disappeared. Emma! It was the first time he'd said my name all day without rushing through it. I'd like to talk. Olivia squeezed my hand and quietly walked away. My father stared at the floor before meeting my eyes. I was wrong. The words seemed unfamiliar to him. I thought keeping everything simple protected this family. I didn't answer. He continued. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing my own daughter. His voice cracked. I reduced your entire life to one sentence because I never bothered asking for the rest of the story. For years, I had imagined this conversation. I'd pictured myself listing every hurt, every disappointment, every time I'd felt invisible. Instead, I felt strangely calm. You know what hurt the most? I asked. He nodded slowly. I think I do. No. I shook my head. It wasn't that you didn't tell people what I did. He looked confused. It was that you never seemed interested in finding out who I was becoming. His shoulders dropped. There was nothing he could say to argue with the truth. A few moments later, my mother approached us. Her eyes were red. Not from embarrassment, from reflection. I judged you before I understood you, she said quietly. I kept trying to protect an image of our family and forgot that family should protect each other. For the first time in my life, her apology didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded human. I took a slow breath. I'm not asking either of you to be proud of my career." They looked at me. "I just wanted you to be proud that I was your daughter." Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence says everything words cannot. And the evening came to an end. Guests began leaving the reception. Several people stopped to introduce themselves properly, not because of Judge Brooks, because they finally saw me as a person instead of an afterthought. When I stepped outside, the cool night air carried the sound of waves crashing against the shore. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Olivia. "Dinner next week? Just the two of us. No parents, no expectations." I smiled and replied with one word: "Absolutely." As I slipped my phone into my pocket, I realized something. The greatest victory wasn't that a federal judge had recognized my work. It wasn't the applause. It wasn't watching old assumptions fall apart. The real victory was walking away without needing anyone's approval to know my own worth. Some forms of justice don't arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes they arrive the moment you stop allowing other people's opinions to define your story. And that was the moment I finally felt free.